This is the second event in our series of webinars co-hosted by the AERA Social Studies Research SIG and the CUFA Scholars of Color Forum. Throughout this series, we will discuss issues related to racial justice, equity, and inclusion in social studies teacher education and education broadly. We are honored to have a distinguished group of panelists here with us today. First, Dr. Jane Lowe, Assistant Professor of Teacher Education at Michigan State University. Hi, Jane, welcome. Second, we have Dr. Natasha Murray-Everett, Assistant Professor of Curriculum and Instruction and Literacy Education at West Virginia University. In addition, we have Dr. Jeremy Stoddard, Professor of Curriculum and Instruction and the Faculty Chair of Secondary Education at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Finally, the discussion will be moderated by Dr. Jesús Tirado, Assistant Professor of Social Studies Education at Auburn University and the Chair of the CUFA Scholars of Color Forum. Before we begin, here are a few expectations for everyone. First, for those of you in the audience, we'd ask that you keep your microphones on mute and your cameras off throughout the event. This will assist with managing bandwidth and to keep focus on our panelists. If you would like to ask the panelists a question, please share it in the chat feature of Zoom. Shout out to Delandria Hall, a graduate student at the University of Texas at Austin, who will be curating the questions to ask the group when the Q&A session begins. Additionally, we expect that comments shared in the chat feature are respectful, thoughtful, and appropriate. If any comments are shared by the audience members that distract from the purpose of this event or are racist, sexist, homophobic, or in any way derogatory, we reserve the right to remove audience members from the session. Zoom bombing will not be tolerated. Without delay, now I hand it off to Dr. Tirado to lead us in this wonderful discussion. Jesús, take it away.
Excellent. It's great to be here with everybody. Let's jump right in since we don't have much time. I'd like to begin by giving each of you a few minutes to discuss the following. What are the 1 to 2 foundational considerations teachers should take into account when teaching about the presidential election? Dr. Lowe, just because there's a storm heading your way, we don't know. Why don't we start with you?
Thanks, Jesús. So I think one of the first things that I would tell teachers is to not be afraid of teaching about elections. So like, don't shy away from teaching about it or engaging with the topic. But that said, you know, we learned from the 2016 election that the results can often be traumatic for students. So it's not something that you can sort of just jump into without doing a lot of sort of preparation beforehand. And so some teachers, because of that, then just sort of avoid the difficult stuff and only teach about the electoral process or things like that. And I get that that's important and necessary. It's important for kids to know how elections actually work. I would argue that it's even more important to teach students about all of it, right? Like sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And like any good sort of lesson plan that you do with controversial issues, you really have to set up the classroom first as a safe environment for discussions and foster the kind of atmosphere and relationships with your students and among your students that really help them feel safe and supported. And of course, if at all possible, your students really should have already done some reflective identity work. And what I mean by that is they should have had time to really consider not just their own experiences, but also the experiences of others in the classroom, right? And so specific to the election, and of course, this election in particular, I think it's really important for students to recognize that it is actually possible for someone to have different experiences than them and not be wrong, right? So I think this notion of, you know, it's really important to notice our own experiences, but also recognizing the experiences of others as well. And so I think that difference in itself is, you know, is not a bad thing. So I think helping students get that is really, really important. And so I think for elections this year, unfortunately, we can't always depend on our current leaders to carry that message, right? A lot of election has become sort of bombasting the other side. And so I think this is why it's even more important for teachers to really help students understand that differences are okay when teaching about election. It's not just about winning, right? And that the winning of the race is really a fleeting aspect of the long-term process of politics anyway. And really politics is about a long process of compromise. So I'll stop there and let my panelists chime in.
Dr. Murray-Everett, do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I think Dr. Lowe really nailed it on the head there. I think, you know, students are walking into the classroom with different perspectives and they're going to view and see these issues and policies and the candidates differently. as a result of their lived experience, and how they walk through the world, right? And so I think as a result, there will be categorically different beliefs and attitudes towards the election. And I think teachers need to understand that and really lay a foundation or a groundwork for students to be aware of that, right? That some may be vested more than others, depending on those experiences and how certain policies and issues really may impact them and or their families.
Thank you. Dr. Stoddard?
Yeah, I'll just add on. I mean, I think everything that's been said is right on. I think this year, because depending which state you're in or which locale, your students may be virtual, they may be in class to some degree. I think it's also really good to take an opportunity to just get from your students, how are they experiencing the election? I think even within your class, there's probably a wide range of what they're being exposed to at home, what they're not. We're all spending way too much time on screens, which means we're seeing ads or information or disinformation pop up. So I think really talking about how they are experiencing, what they're seeing, what they're not seeing, and you know, I'll get into it a little bit later, but sort of looking at that broader system that is American politics, which unfortunately, as both my colleagues have said, you know, is not great right now. It's not a great example. And I would also encourage them to look more locally. You know, what does the presidential election look like across their state? Or how is it impacting sort of the down ballot types of races or issues that really could impact them locally, including their peers in their classes?
Yeah, and I just sort of want to jump on what Jeremy was saying, if I may. I think it's really important that even though this panel is talking about the presidential election, it's really, really important for students to also understand sort of the implications, right? I think oftentimes the presidential election is the thing that gets the most, you know, amount of spotlight, or it's in the limelight. But in reality, as we know as adults, that the down ballot stuff is the stuff that really impacts us a lot more. And so that doesn't mean that presidential elections don't have that larger impact. It absolutely impacts students' lives in real ways, especially as we saw in 2016. Actual policies happen that impact students in that way. But I think it's also important for them to see how locally some of those policies can be counteracted by state level policies or even local policies as a way to kind of check the balances. And I think that's something that's really important for students to understand, even as they're thinking about the president.
Definitely important to keep in mind. I like the overall thing, really keep things complex and keep things knowledgeable as opposed to just sort of keeping it simple. Dr. Stoddard, you were talking a bit before, but I was wondering if you could go into your work on critical media literacy and how it might help us make sense of how to keep this process complicated for students and how we can deal with the often misleading information that we're being bombarded with.
Yeah, so I was trying to think of, I think there's sort of three different ways that we can think about some of the more critical media literacy, which is, you know, really looking at sort of issues of power and how we're engaging with different forms of information. There's a lot of existing stuff out there on how to engage students in like verifying different sources or trying to corroborate whether or not the information is accurate. And so I don't want to get into too much in that. I think that's been around for a long time. But the key parts there are also, I think, asking, you know, why are they seeing this particular story if they're running across their own news feed? Who is the audience that's intended for? Asking some of those important questions then starts to get them to think about why people are producing particular stories or advertisements, and then why are we actually seeing them? Is it because of the particular demographic group we're in? Is it the region we're in? Is it, you know, if you're in a state like Wisconsin or another sort of battleground state right now, we're being inundated with these things, whereas people in states that are clearly polarized one way or the other probably aren't seeing as much of that. So actually taking a second and looking at sort of the role of media and politics in general and the billions of dollars that are being pumped into it and looking at it from a systemic point of view, I think can be really key. Another thing I think that we don't often do enough is to start to look at not just some of the visual elements of, say, an advertisement, but also look at how the race is being covered in the media. We have this horse race sort of mentality that's really being driven by trying to get people to click on stories, trying to get viewers for a newscast. We're inundated with this stuff because they only make money if we're watching or going to their sites. So thinking about the power that comes behind the billions of dollars that are out there to try to get us to go to particular sites. And that's also what's leading us to some of these issues around propaganda or disinformation campaigns that we're falling for. So I think engaging students both epistemically in terms of thinking about what expertise is, what should they trust or not trust in different news is one particular approach. Getting them also think about it from, I think, Joe Kahn and his research study around motivated reasoning was also important, right? So thinking about how are their own political views, experiences coming into play in terms of what they're believing or not, who they're getting information from or not, who they're trusting, right? It's not necessarily the news source, but it's, if I see Jane sharing a story with me, I'm going to think about it in a particular way, regardless of what that news source is. So what are they doing in terms of their own social media to think about sharing information or not sharing information when they see a post? I think Ellen Middaugh is also doing a lot of really good work around that in terms of the ethics of what are they sharing or not sharing. And I think that's a sort of an area of a new direction of sort of media literacy that we haven't really gotten into yet. And the last sort of piece I would say is really get them to challenge sort of the narrative of how elections are covered, and then go deeper into forget personality for a second, even though it's really hard, right? Especially if you watch these debates, it's really hard to forget personality and all these other things. And actually look at some of the platforms. Do they actually have policies outlined or not? Do they go to the websites and look at it? And don't necessarily just assume that because it's even a good, reputable journalistic outfit you're getting information from, that they don't have a particular angle on the story or a particular thing that they're trying to do, right? I think we don't want students to go down the slippery slope of there is no truth, but we also need to recognize that different journalistic sources have bias, and it's important to know sort of within the range of more bias to less bias, or being able to verify that information for yourself.
I think those are all good little nuggets there to think about, especially like getting students to think about the ways in which they're consuming and how teachers can help students get ready for that kind of.
And one of the stats that's always shocking is I think Trump got estimated $1 billion of free coverage essentially for his campaign last time around. He didn't have to pay for it, and it was basically because of news sources, because he attracts viewers.
Yeah, a lot of free advertising, and the media said, I feel like half their stories in 2016 were like, we don't want to cover this, but here we go.
And it continues, yeah.
And you can, you're right. Just a reminder, put questions in the chat if you've got any are popping up. Dr. Murray-Everett, your work in elementary social studies teacher education has examined current events as a way to make sense of what's going on in the world. Could you speak to how this process might be helpful to teaching about the election?
Yeah, so I actually do, I work specifically with elementary social studies pre-service teachers, and a lot of my work actually does look at critical media literacy and having students really kind of corroborate and fact check and all the things that Jeremy just shared. But I really want my pre-service teachers to learn about and examine current events and issues that are going on, right? I want them to be aware of what's going on in the world, to learn that they have the ability to enact change when they see or hear something that they don't necessarily agree with. So engaging in current events, I believe, helps them to become more informed, to become, active citizens in society. So my hope is that by engaging with their peers, my students engaging with their peers on current event topics that are controversial in nature, that they're going to learn how to dialogue across differences in a more civil way. And that takes time and energy and effort. So I often have my students work in what I call news groups or current event groups. So that's where they're finding news, media sources on different outlets on particular topics like immigration or racial protesting or teacher activism, for example, but they do it from multiple perspectives, and then they discuss their findings with each other in groups. So I do often start off by having them focus explicitly on what are they reading, what are they seeing in the news? I think it almost kind of helps them like lower some of their defenses, and kind of puts them a little bit on a leveling playing field. And then naturally, this then has them actually discussing what they agree with, what they disagree with. And then as time goes on, they really do kind of develop a comfort level talking about their opinions and their perspectives about the issues that, you know, as adults, we often have a hard time doing, right? And so with the election, it's really no different for me. The election is current, it's controversial, there's a host of issues and policies, and thus it really makes for a really rich current event topic that I have my students engage in. So, you know, this year in particular, I really have my students focus on policies and the issues like public health and immigration, and really kind of dive into that, like I said, from multiple perspectives, and from what are the conservatives saying, what are the liberals saying, and then also looking specifically at what the candidates are saying and the policies that they're proposing. So going on to their sites and looking to see what they have written down and what they've said. And so this really helps my students to understand, you know, more deeply how these policies may impact them, as well as those who are different from them, which are the things that we're doing when we engage in current events. So I think for me, like doing the election doesn't really feel, it's heavy, right? Like this election cycle is very heavy, but it doesn't really feel any different than what I do with current events, because the election is a current event issue, right? It's something that's ongoing all of the time.
Thank you for that. I especially like, you talked about distance in like a really like positive way. I enjoyed that. And, like, do you find that when you're doing that, students then sort of more, I don't know if intellectualize is the right word, but they sort of approach it more from a task before they start thinking about it at a personal level?
Yep.
Awesome. Dr. Lowe, your works explored civic identity in a variety of social studies classrooms. Can teaching about the presidential election assist students in developing their own civic identities?
I love that the question is formed as a yes or no, so I'll just say yes. I'm
All right.
just kidding. No, absolutely, right? And so I think what's interesting, as both of my colleagues have pointed out, right, I think media is playing up a particular way of us looking at elections these days. Of course, media has always been there, right? We know this as social studies educators, that bias and propaganda has always been around. But I think, you know, the way media and social media especially has sort of catapulted some of these things. And I think the way media covers it now is really about sort of personalities or caricatures, right? And so I think in some ways it's what social studies is supposed to help teach against, right? Like that sort of bias that happens, and to help students not get sucked into that. And so I think it is important for students to see, you know, that the business end, right, the advertising, the money and all of that isn't the only process of politics. And so I think in terms of like civic identity, it's really important for students to see themselves in that, right? Because I think if you just look at the business end of politics or elections, it's really hard for students to see how they can impact that without having millions of dollars or lots of money to donate or like all of these kinds of things, buying ads or, you know, being influencers or something, right? But I think it is still important for students to see themselves in that process. And as I say that, I'm cognizant of the fact that we are about to vote for 2 old white guys as our choices for president. And so there's some, now you can talk about the politics behind it and why that is and all of those things, but you can imagine students not seeing themselves immediately, right, in the candidates of these two choices that don't seem like that great of choices to some students, right? And so I think part of it is for students to not feel like the outcome has failed them somehow, right? Like, so no matter who wins, that the outcome hasn't failed them. And we know from the literature, you know, I think about like Beth Rubin's work about, you know, civic disjuncture happening where students don't see themselves as part of the system or the process. My most recent work kind of talks about this as an aspect of civic debt, right? Like the debt that we owe students of color and in them not seeing themselves in the process. And so we know that like these things happen, and we can't let this election be one of yet like another experience where students, especially students of color, feel like the system has let them down, right? And I think what's particularly challenging are the ways in which, like I talked about earlier, that elections are run nowadays, right? It's not really about the governance. It's not really about what students can be doing or the people can be doing. It's really about these like two individuals. It feels like these two individuals trying to win this race. And so I think there's a lot of belittling and delegitimizing that happens in the current election process. And we have to really help students learn that politics and election really is beyond that, right? So to help build student civic identity so that they're not sort of discouraged or complacent in the process, to be able to see, I think this is where, going back to what Jeremy said earlier about like looking at the down ballot stuff, right? Looking at locally what's happened, because even though the candidate of their dreams may not, one, be running, or two, have won the election, by the time that it happens, there might be lots of things down ballot that are things that students could really grab onto as local issues or state issues that, they can see themselves in. There are lots of, across the country, there are different petitions and other things that are, referendums and things like that students can buy into and see the things that are really going to help them, like actually help them in their local communities beyond just this, the one guy won or another guy won. And I don't want to sort of downplay the results of the election. We know that this election in particular is extremely important for all sorts of reasons. And I don't want to sort of downplay that, but I think it is really important for students to be able to see that, as they're building their identities as sort of political beings, that one election isn't the end all be all. And I particularly worry about the students for whom this election would be their first. Right? This is like the first election from which they judge all other elections that they participate in for the rest of their adulthood. And so I would want those students to really understand that this is not normal. It shouldn't be normal. And even if it feels like normal, you as citizens and as participants in our democracy, we have sort of a duty and responsibility to ensure that this is not the norm, right? And that there are things that we can do to ensure that future elections and things that happen later on sort of don't play out this way, and that there is kind of seeing their agency, if you will, in the process that they can do that with.
I think if I can just add on one thing there, one of the things, I did a survey of teachers after the midterm elections, and one of the things that we heard from a lot of teachers across the country, especially ones that were in states that didn't have competitive races, was that their students were really actively following and discussing races in other states that did sort of some of the things that Jane was just talking about. So the Abrams in Georgia, the governor's race, they were really interested in, or some of the House races across the country where you had new younger women candidates of color who were getting elected. So I think there are ways to engage students in that broader election, maybe, even if the presidential election doesn't fit. But for some of us, it means going out of the state, right? We're so gerrymandered that it's impossible to even find competitive races maybe in the states that you're in. But I would encourage teachers to actually look around and see where are there ones that their students might get excited about. And that's maybe one upside of the media sort of ecology that we have right now, is they can really follow those things pretty easily.
Good advice from both of you. Dr. Starr, your work with the IS-funded project Purple States relates directly to today's topic. Can you share a little bit about this project and how it might help teachers engage with students around election issues?
Yeah, sure. I'll just briefly sort of share a little bit. So we're developing essentially a simulation, and it places kids in the role of people who are actually running these kinds of ad campaigns. So they're developing sort of strategies on state level public policy issues. And I'm just gonna say why we sort of did that and give it some sort of big pieces. It's currently under development. So within 2 years, it'll be out and hopefully accessible for teachers in some of the states where we're in. But we focused on a couple of things that I think might be useful for groups. One is we focused on state level issues and public policy issues that would warrant sort of lobbying or interest from different groups. So everything from current gun control, police reform, also looking at things like environmental impacts. And we chose a state level because we wanted them to look across the state and try to understand why different regions in a state might have people with different political views. And as Jane said, be able to see that people might disagree with them for some real reasons, economic, social, environmental, whatever their causes might be, and not think that they're automatically crazy or evil or whatever it might be. So we wanted to focus on the state. We also focused on the state level and issues instead of politicians to avoid that personality piece and to get them to think about that sort of civic agency piece that Jane was talking about. So how can they transfer what they're learning in the simulation into action that they might take using similar types of strategies that they learn? And then the third and sort of biggest reason why we did it is we're actually sort of testing a hypothesis from long media education sort of world, which is by understanding how producers do things within media, you better, when you see them sort of out in the real world, you'll understand the decisions that have been made that have shaped sort of what that media looks like and maybe who it's made for and how you interact with it. So in this case, we're essentially teaching them about this system of millions of dollars being pumped into advertising or media or journalism types of campaigns to try to mobilize voters or influence voters. And then we can actually have them reflect on that system and take a look at it and say, understand it, one, but also how do they react to it? Is there a different way that maybe we can operate that doesn't entail wealthy donors or corporations pumping money into these things, and we actually engage more thoughtfully in issues? And there's some good models out there of how people are actually doing that. But those are some of the goals that we have. I think the last piece of it is having it be a platform where they can really also look at their own sort of, we call them epistemic aims, or sort of their information seeking behaviors. So not just can they read a text, can they identify the argument, can they identify the evidence that's there, but more so think about what's their behavior going to be when they do run across an issue that they care about. Are they automatically going to go with information that aligns with their existing views? Are they going to seek out other information? Are they going to know how to take action based on what they care about? Whether it's some form of online sort of digital engagement, or taking that back into the streets more, which is what we have seen over the last year on a lot of issues, and especially among young people, be it climate change, gun control, or the events of this past summer. So anyway, so that's sort of the gist of the project, and hopefully by another year or so here, we'll have a lot of good both research and really practical stuff out from it.
That sounds exciting, and I like the whole goal of trying to get students to engage with the issues, which I know a couple of y'all on the panel have talked about. I want to move us all to a question that we're all gonna, well, you are, I'm not gonna answer it, but I know it's one that people talk about a lot, and I'm hoping that we can have a nice sort of round discussion about this. Teachers often wonder about what role, if any, their personal political beliefs should play in teaching about the election. So just, what do y'all think about that? How should teachers account for their own personal beliefs when teaching about elections, and this election in particular? And I'll just let whoever feels more compelled to speak first go ahead.
Guess I will just say that there's obviously been a lot of work done on sort of teacher disclosure, right, out there. And so the literature basically says sort of both and, right, in terms of teacher disclosure. There are studies that suggest that that teachers often avoid disclosing for all sorts of reasons, and that it is important, especially for students in younger grades, not to influence or impact their sort of identity and thinking, right? Because I think this particularly happens in middle school, where teachers don't want to say kind of what their own political beliefs are, because 12 and 13-year-olds are sort of very sort of easily swayed by the adults in their lives and things like that. And so there's sort of a good literature on that. But then there's also studies on the other end that suggest that disclosing can actually help build sort of that rapport and relationship and trust in your classroom as well. And so what I've always told teachers is that it really depends, right? It's as good teaching is, it really depends on your context and the situation. And so I've worked with teachers who will say, you know, no, I will forever never disclose because I'd rather take the position of playing devil's advocate because that's more useful in the context of the diversity of students and voices of my classroom. But I've also worked with really great teachers who've said, no, absolutely, it's necessary because as a white man who was teaching in an urban, you know, mostly students of color setting, if he wanted his students to kind of open up and be honest and do sort of that reflective identity work when talking about politics, then he needs to model that, not as a way to suggest how they should believe, but it's a way for him to model the kind of work that he's doing internally, especially if he's expecting his students to do that and be vulnerable with him as well, right? So you can see how in both cases that, you know, disclosing or not disclosing can benefit the classroom. And so I tell teachers, you know, what you have to think about is, again, with all good teaching, having that discernment, right? You have to know your students, know the context. And schooling is not a place for you to sort of push your own agenda or whatever it is. You're there for the students and to help them develop and create supportive environments for them to really think about and be reflective about not just themselves, but of course, all these different perspectives that we've been talking about in the last 30 minutes or so. And so whatever can help foster that is what I say teachers should do with sort of the disclosure question.
I was just going to say, beyond disclosure, I think one thing that I would say, I think there's probably very little disagreement about is, you know, making sure teachers are, you know, being models in terms of just being political agents and not hiding that part. So whether it's even talking about voting as a really simple thing or, you know, going beyond whatever actions it is, I think it's really important for teachers to model that they are political beings, right? That they do engage in different things, whether or not they decide to disclose their views on one specific issue or not. I think it really is important to be sort of models in that sense, and encouraging that in their students, regardless of their students' political views. I think I also, you know, I've worked in places where I've had, you know, really one side sort of political views and ones that have been really diverse in terms of political ideologies. And I think also reminding ourselves that, you know, in your classroom, you're going to have a wide range of political ideologies there. And some are fully formed, some are really not fully formed yet, or where they come from. And so I think it's important to recognize that regardless if you disclose or don't disclose, that you likely do have really conservative and really liberal students in your room, and you want them to engage in that classroom and have kind of that trust that Jane's talking about. So I always really am careful about keeping that in mind and making sure that I don't, you know, don't either allow students or myself to chill anyone's sort of political ideas, and I'd rather have them encouraged and out there in whatever format you're able to sort of foster in your classroom.
Yeah, I think that both Jane and Jeremy have brought up really great points, and I think to Jane's point about, you know, the literature really does show the benefits of both. But I think I want to be really clear in stating that, like, as teachers, like, there is no neutral. Neutrality doesn't really exist in a classroom. And so whether you come out and state what your political belief is or not, your students are going to probably know what side of the aisle you fall on particular issues. So, you know, just to be aware of that, just own it. You know, like it is what it is. Like I don't have to come out and tell my students that I am a Biden or Trump loving Democrat or Republican without them not probably knowing. They probably know. They look at the readings that I assign, they look at the way in which I talk, and that comes out. And so I think we just need to just kind of like be okay with that, right? And so I think that establishing that trust, allowing students to recognize that you don't have to believe what I believe, whether I share that belief or not, whether I actually disclose it or not, is really the first step, right? And so if you kind of have some of those norms and you kind of really have established that trust that you can share how you feel about whatever side of the aisle you're on, I think that's what matters more than anything on whether I share my belief or not, to be quite, you know, honest.
Yeah, and just to build off what Natasha's saying there, I always start my first sort of methods class. We talk about sort of what different conceptions of good citizenship are, right? Which I'm sure many of you do as well. And I always just really blatantly tell them whether you sort of want to teach particular types of citizens or not in your class, you are. So let's do it really consciously and be aware of what we're doing and be thoughtful about it, versus just sort of having it come in more organic ways. So being really explicit in terms of we are producing citizens coming out of our classrooms. What do we want them to be prepared and sort of what they we want them to know and be able to do, right?
Yeah, and this reminds me that, like all teaching is political, right? So it's not just social studies, it's not just the elections, or like all teaching is political. And so I think to Natasha's point, right, being aware of that and, not pretending like it's not, is a really important first step.
All good points. And yeah, teaching is definitely political. So how do we get teachers ready to do this work, teaching the election, being political? What pre-work resources and strategies would you suggest teachers undertake?
I think from the media side, one of the things I've been thinking about, and it's in particular because I have been inundated whenever I open a screen lately, it's all these advertisements. And we're getting ones in particular also because of some of the protests for the summer. So for example, we're seeing an ad a lot that is a sort of suburban house mom in a minivan whose car is being attacked by protesters and like the windows are being broken in. And the message is, the sort of law and order, vote for Trump message. But it's almost traumatic. The video is really dark, right? It's scary. And so I think, is this an unprecedented thing? And the speakers and we were talking about this the other day too, like are there similar historical sort of precedents of campaigns that get this ugly? And one way to look at that is some of the, there's the living room candidate types of sites that have old ads from previous campaigns. You can go back and look at the Willie Horton ad. You can go back and look at the Daisy Girl ad from Johnson's campaign. You can look at the Law and Order types of ads from Nixon's campaigns and compare it to today. Like, where do some of these really, race baiting sort of tropes come from? Where does some of this imagery come from? Where do some of these narratives come from? Because they've been around a long time in many cases. They aren't necessarily new. And so I think one way to do it for students to help them to, I think, again, not become too cynical or afraid to engage in something is to say, look, these have been around a long time. Folks during the civil rights movement and trying to get rights to vote were fighting against some of these same narratives. And so to really look backwards almost and see where are these same sorts of storylines, narratives, arguments being made in the past, imagery that's used, and how can that help us to think about, the power of what that means today. And what it represents essentially. So I would say one way to look at it is sort of looking back at the way these campaigns have been run historically, and to see, especially it's pretty easy now from a sort of media perspective to see some of those things. One of the things that I was not shocked by but horrified by was now I'm trying to think of the name museum. There's a traveling exhibit going around that showed really racist representations related to campaigns. Historically, and especially African-American representations. And I saw it in Connecticut at a museum, but they had artifacts from Obama's elections in 2008 and 2012 that really portrayed these same types of caricatures that you would have seen, in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so I think being aware that some of those things still exist out there, along with some of the new alt-right kinds of things, is, your students and how you can engage with them. But being aware that these things are real and that they exist, I think is important. I think too oftentimes we do sweep some of that under the rug, when we do need to be able to talk about these discourses that are to some degree out in plain sight again.
And I was just going to add to that and say that I think, as Jeremy pointed out, we had this kind of brief conversation yesterday on how sort of like taking the long view of this is important, right? Like I think students and even ourselves, we're living in it in the moment right now. And so it feels really visceral and feels really real. But if you look, sort of take the historical long view of it, as Jeremy pointed out, a lot of this is it's not new stuff. It's not like all of a sudden people have become terrible overnight or something. This stuff has been around. I mean, and so that's sort of the unfortunate piece of it. But I think it helps sort of give students that perspective that it's like the world isn't all of a sudden now more terrible. Like there's some things that have just kind of, floated along and sort of beneath the surface. Now, I would say though, to fight off the cynicism of that, right? Because you can imagine a kid then be like, well, why do we bother? This has been around and nothing's changed. So I think it is really important to also combat that by kind of showing students, right? There's a lot of work in the civics field with like action civics or things that students can get involved in so that they can feel that agency to see like, we are now a smaller part of a longer story, if you will, right? The story is sort of the bad part of the story is consistent, but so are the good parts of the story. So how do we elongate that fight? How do we continue that fight? How do we ensure that the things that we're doing, tries to mitigate some of these things that we've seen in history for a long time? And how do we turn the page, use technology, use media to help not make the matter worse, right? Not kind of falling into the pit of despair and those kinds of things, but like, how do we use that for a positive spin, or how do we do that and help students see ways to be able to engage in positive ways so that they can, again, back to agency, right? Hold some of that agency to feel like they are empowered to do something about some of these trends that they're seeing.
Dr. Murray, is there something you'd like to add?
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize I got unmuted. I'm sorry. Yeah, my son is right next to me. My apologies.
No, you're fine.
It's okay. I was thinking about the resources component, and I think that there's a host of things that are available online to help teachers kind of utilize when thinking about teaching this stuff. And I'm always going to go back to like teaching tolerance. Like they just came out with a great Future Voters Project kit, and PBS Learning Media is really great. I think it's important to also talk about like the Voting Rights Act. I think that's also an important component of the election, and there's a lot of new stuff on that because that has become something that's come back with some of the recent legislation that's come down. So I think those are also some really good things that teachers might want to keep in mind and consider when teaching about this stuff.
I think there's also some good resources. One of the things I think that can be really challenging to go back to sort of how elections are covered too is it's a lot of data literacy, right? Mm-hmm. Polling is especially these days is more suspect than it used to be. It's got its limits, but I think it's also good to look at the growing rates in different elections in terms of youth voting, or some of these things that might also feel empowering. And Circle compiles a lot of that data and shares it out, which is usually really helpful. But actually going through and looking at what do some of these data visualizations mean, and finding the same, I found like the same survey represented in different broadcasts or different news sources. And by the way they shape the graph, it can tell a completely different story. So finding ways that the same polling results can actually tell a different story based on whatever headline they want to tell. I think those types of activities with students can be really useful, as well as what I think was said before is, comparing, like after the debate last night, I would have my students go on and look at 4 different news sources and see how they covered it. What was the story from the debate and why was it presented that way based on who their audience is for that particular news site. And I think that can be a really good way to also to get at, again, it's not that any of them are not factual, right? So they might be all exactly accurate in terms of covering that debate, but they're all going to tell a slightly different story. And I think those types of activities can be really useful just to teach about the nature of politics, as well as some of the specifics from the election.
Thanks. Before we get into audience questions, I've just got one last question that I'd like us to talk about. We're pretty close to the election, about 10, 11 days away, I believe. What would you like teachers to keep in mind as we move towards that election, and even after the election and the results are decided?
I guess the first thing I would say, a friend of mine shared this with me earlier today, and it would be to breathe. I think no matter who ends up winning, we need to like be able to breathe and figure it out. I also think too that, some of your students are probably going to come into your classroom scared, afraid, upset, depending on the outcome on either end. And we need to be sensitive to that, right? Like, I think we saw this in 2016. This is an election that really impacts people, their livelihoods, their families. And so we need to give students space to voice that. So if you're in a district or if you're in a school building that allows you to talk, then I would encourage you, carving out space to do that. And allowing students to, I'm always thinking about K through 6, so I'm always thinking about the younger kids, definitely allowing space and opportunity for kids to write or draw out their feelings, because I taught in a school district that was predominantly Black and Latino, and so I'm still in touch with a lot of those students, and I know how they felt in 2016. I know how I feel, so just really allowing space and opportunity to talk, right? To write, to articulate how they're feeling about the results.
Yeah, and
I think sort of similarly, right, to what Natasha was saying is that, it's kind of what I mentioned earlier. I think it's important to help to set up the environment. So like the day after election, know that, because depending on your classroom, right, like someone lost. Like, so someone like, and because of the way the campaign has been run and the way that media has been basically pushing the polarization that's happening in the country, like into this one campaign, into like this one, like Biden versus Trump ticket, that there are people who are going to feel disengaged and disparaged, like no matter what happens. Now you might be in one of the places in your teaching and everyone is celebratory, right? No matter whoever won, or everyone is despondent or depressed. And so I think being able to have a plan in mind, right? Thinking about what does that mean, and how do you kind of, and you might have personal feelings about what happens, but besides giving students a room to kind of breathe and feel, I think part of it is also helping them see that like you didn't lose everything, even though it feels like it. It does feel like it. And again, I don't want to downplay the very real, like terrible experiences of family and individuals after the 2016 election, but it isn't often as sort of immediate as students might think and feel. And so I think being able to help students see that, and I know there were teachers that I spoke with in 2016, I was like, I just didn't know what to say. Or like I just like, they were shocked, they were taken aback, and they didn't know what to do. And so I think maybe we can learn from that and understand that like no matter what happens, there is going to be that moment. These are not sort of like inconsequential things that we don't want, like we have to beg kids to pay attention to. They're going to know, and they're going to have opinions and feelings about these things. So having time set aside to have really good conversations and deep conversations about why things happen the way that they happen, and helping kids understand that this doesn't mean that like the world is over, like the world isn't ending. It might feel that way, but how do you then move forward? How do you think about that, right? And especially the way our government system is set up, knock on wood, I shouldn't like make too many promises, right? There are term limits for a reason, and there are these changes for a reason. There are midterm elections, there are all of these things as checks and balances that I think more people need to have a better understanding about, because it's easy to get away from the like, oh, well, we lost that one and that's it. And not realizing, no, that's just one little step of lots of things that happen. And one could argue we're in the situation we're in terms of polarization because not enough of the everyday people know how that stuff works. And it got co-opted by the people who wanted to use it for their own agenda and whatever it is, and it ended up pushing people aside because not enough sort of everyday run-of-the-mill folks understand how the process actually works.
Yeah, I think I would just add on top of all these. Well, for one thing, I would say I think I'm going to take a social media break, and just not watch it for a couple days, especially if this thing's ongoing as we know it might be, and I might be still working in a campaign polling site like I am going to be on November 3rd. It might be a long day, or days. I think the other things to look at, in addition to sort of the impact of this presidential, which it is obviously very emotional for many, many reasons, is to also look at what were the results of all those other parts of the election and what might it mean for the issues that we really care about. Because regardless of who wins the presidential election, they don't have all the power to do everything. And so looking at what did your state legislature turnouts look like if you're in a state that's running them during this year? What is your congressional, outputs, and what does that mean for votes on particular issues that might be out there, depending on your grade level, right? If there's certain issues your kids care about, let's look at what the impact of the overall election might be on those particular issues, and then start talking about what can you do? What can you do as young people to re-engage after the election in ways that might be meaningful, and start to talk about those things. So I think then maybe you get away a little bit from either you're channeling the enthusiasm if your person won, or you're getting away from the sort of despondent aspect, as Jane was saying, if they lost, and channel that sort of desire to see change into action that your students can take.
Oh, good points. Thank you all so much. We're now going to turn to some questions that have been put into the chat. We've got about 8 minutes left, so I'm hoping we can get to a couple of them. From Linda, it was specifically for you, Dr. Murray-Everett. It was about whether your class was meeting face-to-face or virtually, and about how you're building community across these different platforms if you are using different platforms and methods to teach.
Yeah, so we are fully online, and we meet twice a week. And so every single week, students meet in groups and talk about articles and news reports that they have found. And they're actually in another group project as well with the same students. And so I think having a regular meeting every week has helped to build and foster some of that relationship. And then even though the students aren't cohorted, they do take courses together. So they're used to being on Zoom, online, and they've had face-to-face classes in the past. So I don't think that has been as difficult. This is the first time that they're really talking about like some personal deep things and how they feel about it. But they've been handling it well. At least when I'm entering the breakout rooms, I feel like I hear students sharing what they've read or what they've watched, and then after they talk about like what they've read, what they've watched, like how it impacts them. I'm also having them kind of fill out a chart that has them talk about like, what is the news saying? What is this saying? How does it impact me? How is it impacting other people? And so I think because they do that legwork prior to talking, it really helps the conversation kind of flow a bit.
Thank you. Dr. Stoddard, Dr. Lowe, did you want to add something of how you've been teaching across platforms?
I was just gonna say, I was taking notes because I've got a methods class in the spring with 29 students in it, and so I'm trying to think about how I'm going to do some of the things that I'd like to do if we're still all virtual. It's a real challenge, I think, and last spring it was easy because we had built up that community and then went online. So I think that would be a great thing for people to share some of those ideas in some form through the SIG or something. For those of us that haven't had to do that part yet. My folks all knew each other, the ones I have this semester, but next semester is going to be, it's a challenge.
So Jeremy, I will say that it took a little longer than normal, but the class and the cohort that I have are starting to they started to sort of get to that point around like week 4 or 5. And so it took a little bit longer, but they did get there. But I think it was a lot of kind of what Natasha was talking about, like just planning ahead and having something else for them to also engage with. So because you can't just sort of put them into small groups and let them chat, like there's not that like cross classroom chatter. And so I sort of purposely let them have sort of like private chat moments where I know that they would need that, and then they sort of turn it off when we don't need it. And I do a lot of sort of share documents sorts of things, or like Padlet, Google Doc, or other formats like that, so that as they're discussing, they have somewhere else to go besides just here with, the faculty member always watching over them.
Yeah, I've realized how much I also depended on those moments when we took a break or when students are coming in and out of the classroom to check in with students on things, especially when maybe we did have a really heated discussion. And so I've been trying to find ways, even with the graduate course I'm teaching, to fill that in. And I'm finding that also really challenging because, you know, if you get an email doesn't come across the same way as that quick little conversation on the side of a classroom. And so and maybe we'll all get better at that and more normalized in terms of how we expect and see those things. But that's one of the things I've consciously been trying to do because I know I'm not able to do it in the same way that I would have been able to in that face-to-face classroom. And I think those connections with students can just be really vital for their own sort of ability to get where we want them and to stay sane, frankly.
The emails are not the same, but I would encourage you to do the emails because I've done them and I like pick 5 or 6 students every week and I just say, hey, just checking in, you know, how are you doing? And they really do appreciate it because it's a personal email. I haven't gotten to all 51 of my students, but I've gotten through at least half. So it's not the same, but it's something, and it lets them know that you want to know how they're doing after, you know, a conversation or something that got heated, or even like nothing happened and you just want to check in. So.
I'm definitely a fan of those emails as well, but yeah, they're not as personal as a personal check-in. But I think students are becoming normalized to them and enjoy them. One last question, because I'm conscious of time. We've got about 3 minutes. From Judy, isn't this, I'm just going to read it. Isn't this election different, though, given who Trump is, what he's done, the threats to democracy, and all the damage this administration has done, and how anxious people are about the outcome of this election? How can teachers have civil discussions across differences when this election is so charged and at least there is so much at stake?
I mean, I'm just going to say this doesn't directly answer the question, but one thing I've been thinking a lot about is one of the things that we saw in the 2018, the survey that we did, and some other folks have written about this as well, is this notion that we're seeing teachers feeling compelled to teach things as like balanced or from both sides because of their context that we're in. And we did have some evidence of that. But we also had a lot of evidence of teachers in schools where they felt supported by their administration and by their colleagues, even when their political views were very different from what they perceived their students to be, to really be engaging thoughtfully on issues in their classroom. So I think one of the things with our teacher ed side especially is making sure that students don't feel compelled to teach things as controversial for which we know there's sort of a right answer, just because they know they've got some really loud kids in the room who may bring that up. And there's a lot of ways around to doing that. But then also finding issues where you can really engage in some of these deliberations, and maybe it's an issue that isn't as emotionally charged, for example, but maybe really locally important for them. So what does, if you're in a farming state or an agricultural state, what do some of the issues related to tariffs or trade deals or things mean for your local area, and engage them in it? They may not even know which political views are on each side of it, but it's an important issue that might be to them. Some of these things with police reform would be another one, right? Try to find really genuine issues that you want them to understand more fully. But I think really avoiding this notion of needing the balance part is really important to keep reminding teachers, because that's the piece I think that is worrisome, even beyond the extreme example of the Holocaust one from Florida. I think we are seeing that come up a lot.
And I just want to add, to that, I also think like Trump is not the balance, right? Like we know that. So I think to Jeremy's point, like there's no point in kind of reaching to kind of find a new balance. I think that's sort of point blank, we know that's not the balance. But also the other thing, I sort of, maybe this is too optimistic, but I sort of like refuse to believe that Americans like think Trump is the balance either. Like whether they vote for him or not for all sorts of reasons, I think I just refuse to believe the majority of Americans actually see that as a balanced perspective, or like one side of a balanced perspective, right? So I think there is something to be said that yes, Trump is different, the election is different, it's politically charged in those ways, but I would encourage teachers to then bring it it back, like bring it back to sort of the, because I have so many conservative friends that like are groaning because they're like the conservative platform is being co-opted, right? And same thing on the left and the right. And so it's just bringing that back to talk about sort of like the saner versions of the balance and keeping that balance and not afraid to keep that balance, to Jeremy's point. Like don't entertain sort of like the crazy for the sake of trying to be balanced.
And I think, again, this is somewhere that some of this data can actually help you. Like, I mean, we're looking at gun control in Wisconsin. 80% of Wisconsin people think that we should have background checks for everyone, but we can't get the state legislature to even have a session and discuss it. So I think showing them that the large body of people aren't insane or that extreme on these issues is really important. But then you look at why is that fight like that in the legislature, and that again goes back to sort of where are the influences in terms of some of these political structures.
I think that, again, Jane and Jeremy kind of said it all. That being said, like this is a hard question for me. You know, it is that teaching this election has felt very different than 2008, 2012, the ones prior. You know, it's not possible to teach it in a balanced way. I don't think so. And so it's one that I still wrestle with, to be quite honest and transparent. So.
Well, thank you so much. I'm very conscious of our time, so I want to say thank you to everybody for being here. I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone's question. Just too much good discussion going on. So I know that these conversations will continue on and everywhere, and I hope that we can keep in touch and keep talking about it. So thank you so much. Is there anything else, Dr. Hockman, we have to do before we sign off? Or?
Yeah, I just want to say thanks. And I have one announcement. If I share my screen real quick, let's see. So I just wanted to let you all know that we do have some upcoming webinar topics that we're going to get scheduled. We've really appreciated everyone's interest so far. So we're not exactly sure on the dates of these yet, based on holidays and semesters coming to a close. But these are the things that we're going to be working on: supporting undocumented students in social studies education, talking about equity and allyship in early and elementary social studies, and also the politics of citation and equity scholarship in social studies. So we're really excited about those upcoming events, and check your social media once you have a break, and listservs and whatnot, and we'll have some more information to share with you about that. But to Jane, Jeremy, and Natasha, thank you all, and Jesus, thank you all very much for your time, and best of luck in these last few weeks of election season, hopefully.
Thank you all for putting this together.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.
Bye.